How to Live on 24 Hours a Day. Arnold Bennett. Chapter 1. The Daily Miracle. Yes, he is one of those men who find it difficult to cope with life. He has a good position, a stable and sufficient income to cover both his luxuries and his needs. He is not a big spender. And yet, this man seems to be always in trouble. Somehow, he doesn't know how to make the most of his money. He has an excellent apartment, but it's half empty, and he always seems to be missing things. He has a new suit, but an old hat. He has a great tie, but baggy pants. He invites you to dinner and uses cut glass, but serves shoddy lamb, or bruised Turkish coffee in a broken cup. He can't understand it. The explanation is simple: he wastes his income. I wish I had half of it. I could teach him how to employ it. So most of us, at one time or another, have criticized our superiors. Almost all of us are chancellors of the exchequer. It is the pride of the hour. The newspapers are full of articles, explaining how to live on this or that sum, and these articles provoke a correspondence, the violence of which shows the interest they arouse. Recently, in a daily organ, a battle was fought over the question, whether a woman can live well in the country on £1 a year. I have seen an essay on how to live on 8 shillings a week. But I have never seen a trial of how to live on 24 hours a day. However, it has been said that time is money. That proverb is an understatement. Time is much more than money. If you have time you can get money, usually. But even if you have the wealth of a Carlton hotel closet, you can't buy yourself a minute more time than I have, or my cat has by the fire. Philosophers have explained space, but they have not explained time. It is the inexplicable raw material of everything. With it, everything is possible; without it, nothing. The supply of time is really an everyday miracle, a truly amazing affair, when one examines it. You wake up in the morning, and, lo and behold, your wallet is magically full, 24 hours of the unmade fabric, of the universe of your life. It is yours. It is the most precious of possessions, a most unique asset, which comes to you in a way so unique, as the asset itself denotes. No one can take it from you, nor can it be stolen from you. And no one receives more or less than what you receive. Talk about an ideal democracy. In the kingdom of time there is no aristocracy of wealth, no aristocracy of intellect. Genius is never rewarded, not even with an extra hour a day. And there is no punishment. Waste your infinitely precious good as much as you will, and the supply will never be denied you. No mysterious power will say, "This man is a fool, if not a knave. He is not worth spending time with, he will be cut off." It is safer than consolations, and the payment of rent is not affected by Sundays. Moreover, there is no recourse to the future. Impossible to get into debt. You can only squander the passing moment, and you can't squander tomorrow; it's saved for you. You cannot waste the next hour; it is waiting for you. I said it was a miracle. Isn't it? You have to live with these 24 hours of daily time. From this time you have to spin health, pleasure, money, contentment, respect, and the evolution of your immortal soul. Its correct use, its most effective use, is a matter of the highest urgency, and of the most exciting actuality. Everything depends on it. Your happiness, the elusive prize to which you all cling, my friends, depends upon it. It is strange that the newspapers, as enterprising and current as they are not full of how to live on a certain income of time. Instead of how to live on a certain income of money. Money is much more common than time. When one reflects, one perceives that money is the most common thing that exists. It embodies the earth in heaps. If one cannot manage to live on a certain income of money, one earns a little more, or steals it, or advertises it. One doesn't necessarily complicate one's life because one can't get by on £1,000 a year. One muscles up and earns guineas, and balances the budget. But if one cannot manage to have an income 24 hours a day, which exactly covers all the appropriate items of expenditure, one definitely complicates one's life. The supply of time, though gloriously regular, is cruelly restricted. Who among us lives 24 hours a day? And when I say live, I don't mean exist, nor do I mean get by. Who among us is free from that unsettling feeling that the big spending departments of our daily lives are not being managed as they should be? Who among us is sure that his good suit has not been overtaken by an embarrassing hat, or that he has forgotten the quality of the food because he has been so busy with the dishes? Who has not said to himself, I will change that when I have a little more time? We will never have more time. We have, and always have had, all the time there is. It is the realization of this profound and forgotten truth, which, by the way, I have not discovered, that has led me to undertake a thorough practical examination of the daily expenditure of time. Chapter 2. The desire to surpass one's own program. But, someone may remark, with English indifference, towards anything but the point, what do you want to accomplish with your 24 hours a day? I have no difficulty to live on 24 hours a day. I do everything I want, and I still find time to go to newspaper contests. Surely it is a simple matter, knowing that one has only 24 hours a day, to be content with those 24 hours a day. To you, my dear sir, I offer my apologies and my regrets. You are precisely the man I have wanted to meet, for some 40 years. Will you be good enough to send me your name and address, state your position, and tell me how you do it? Instead of me talking to you, you should talk to me. Please, just introduce yourself. That you exist, I am convinced, and that I have not yet found you is my loss. In the meantime, until you appear, I will continue chatting with my fellow sufferers, that innumerable group of souls who are haunted, more or less painfully, by the feeling that the years are passing, and that they have not yet been able to put their lives in order. If we analyze this feeling, we will perceive that it is mainly one of uneasiness, of expectation, of looking forward, of aspiration. It is a source of constant discomfort, because it behaves like a skeleton, in the feast of all our pleasures. We go to the theater and laugh, but between acts, it raises a skinny finger at us. We rush violently to catch the last train, and as we stand a long while on the platform, waiting for the last train, he walks his bones up and down beside us and asks, "Oh, man, what have you done with your youth? What are you doing with your age?" One may insist that this feeling of continual looking forward, of aspiration, is part of life itself, and inseparable from life itself. And it is true. But there are degrees. A man may desire to go to Mecca, for his conscience tells him that he must go to Mecca. He sets out, with cook's help, or unaided, and he may probably never reach Mecca. He may drown before he reaches Port Said, or he may perish ingloriously on the shore of the Red Sea. His desire may be eternally frustrated. The unfulfilled aspiration will always disturb him. But he will not be tormented in the same way, as the man who, desiring to reach Mecca, and harassed by the desire to reach Mecca, never leaves Brixton. It is something to have left Brixton. Most of us have not left Brixton, and have not even taken a cab to Ludgate Circus, to ask at Cook's, for the price of a guided tour. And our excuse to ourselves, is that there are only 24 hours in the day. If we delve deeper into our vague and uncomfortable aspiration, I think we shall see that it arises from a fixed idea, that we must do something, apart from the things we are loyally and morally obliged to do. We are obliged, by various written and unwritten codes, to keep ourselves and our families, if we have them, in health and comfort, to pay our debts, to save, to increase our prosperity by increasing our efficiency. Quite a difficult task. A task that very few achieve. A task that is often beyond our capacity. However, if we succeed, as sometimes happens, we are not satisfied, the skeleton is still with us. And even when we realize that the task is beyond our capacity, that our faculties cannot cope with it, we feel that we should be less discontented if we gave our already overtaxed faculties something else to do. And such is, in fact, the fact. The desire to do something outside their formal program is common to all men who, in the course of evolution, have risen beyond a certain level. As long as no effort is made to satisfy that desire, the uncomfortable feeling of waiting uncomfortably for something to begin that has not begun will continue to disturb the peace of the soul. That desire has been given many names. It is a form of the universal desire for knowledge. And it is so strong, that many men, who have devoted their whole lives to the systematic acquisition of knowledge, have been impelled by it, to go beyond the limits of their program, in search of more knowledge. Even Herbert Spencer, in my opinion the greatest mind that ever lived, was often compelled by it to enter into pleasant backwaters of inquiry. I imagine that in most people conscious of the desire to live, that is, intellectually curious people, the aspiration to go beyond formal programs takes a literary form. They would like to embark on a course of reading. It is clear that the British people are increasingly literary. But I would like to point out that literature by no means encompasses the whole field of knowledge, and that the restless thirst for self-improvement, for increasing knowledge, may well be quenched outside literature. I will refer later on to the different ways of quenching it. Here I merely point out to those who do not have a natural sympathy for literature that literature is not the only well. Chapter 3. Precautions before beginning. Now that I have succeeded, if I have succeeded at all, in persuading you that you are constantly haunted by a repressed dissatisfaction, due to your own organization of daily life, and that the main cause of that inconvenient dissatisfaction is the feeling that every day you leave undone, something which you would like to do, and which, in fact, you always hope to do when you have more time. And now that I have called your attention to the obvious and dazzling truth, that you will never have more time, since you already have all the time there is, you expect me to reveal to you some wonderful secret, by which you may approach the ideal of a perfect organization of the day. And with which, therefore, you will get rid of that disturbing and unpleasant daily disappointment of things left undone. I have not found that wonderful secret. Nor do I expect to find it, nor do I expect anyone ever to find it. It remains to be discovered. When you began to catch my drift, perhaps hope resurfaced in your breast. Perhaps you said to yourself, "This man will show me an easy and indefatigable way, to do what I have so long desired in vain." Alas, no. The fact is that there is no easy way, no royal road. The road to Mecca is extremely hard and rocky, and worst of all, it is never reached. The most important preliminary step to the task of organizing one's life so that one can live fully and comfortably within one's daily 24-hour budget is the serene realization of the extreme difficulty of the task, the sacrifices and the endless effort it demands. I will never insist on it too much. If you imagine that you can achieve your ideal by ingeniously planning a schedule with a pen on a piece of paper, you had better give up hope at once. If you are not prepared for discouragements and disappointments, if you are not satisfied with a small result in return for a great effort, then don't start. Go back to bed, and resume the restless sleep, which you call your existence. It's very sad, isn't it? Very depressing and gloomy. And yet, I think it's also quite good, this need for the tension of will, before something worthwhile can be done. I like it too. I think it's what sets me most apart from the cat by the fire. Well, you say, suppose I am ready for battle. Assume that I have weighed and carefully understood your ponderous remarks. How do I begin? Dear sir, you simply begin. There is no magic way to start. If a man standing on the edge of a bathtub, wanting to jump into cold water, would ask you, how do I start jumping? You would simply answer, just jump in. Grasp your nerves and jump. As I've said before, the main beauty of a steady supply of time is that you can't waste it in advance. The next year, the next day, the next hour, they are ready for you, as perfect, as intact, as if you had never wasted, or misapplied, a single moment in your entire career. This fact is very gratifying and reassuring. You can turn the page every hour if you wish. Therefore, it is useless to wait until next week, or even tomorrow. You may think, the water will be warmer next week. Well, it won't. It will be colder. But before I begin, let me murmur a few words of warning, in your private ear. First, let me warn you against your own ardor. Ardor in well-doing is a deceitful and treacherous thing. It clamors for employment, you cannot satisfy it at first, it wants more and more, it is eager to move mountains, and divert the course of rivers. He is not content until he perspires. And then, too often, when he feels the sweat on his brow, he suddenly tires and dies, without even taking the trouble to say, I have had enough. Beware of undertaking too much at first. Be content with little, and allow for accidents. Allow for human nature, especially your own. A mediocre failure, in itself, would be unimportant, if it did not mean a loss of self-esteem and self-confidence. But just as nothing succeeds like success, nothing fails like failure. Most people who go bankrupt do so by trying too hard. Therefore, in undertaking the immense enterprise of living fully and comfortably within the narrow confines of the 24 hours of the day, let us avoid at all costs the risk of premature failure. I do not agree that, at least in this business, a glorious failure is better than a small success. I am in favor of small success. A glorious failure leads to nothing, an insignificant success can lead to a success, which is not insignificant. So let's start by examining your time budget for the day. You say your day is already full to overflowing. How? How much do you really spend on earning a living? An average of 7 hours. And on real sleep, 7. I'll add 2 hours, being generous. And I dare you to count the remaining 8 hours. Chapter 4. The cause of the problems. To address at once the question of time expenditure in all its actuality, I must choose an individual case to examine. I can deal with only one case, and that case cannot be the average case, for there is no such thing as the average case, just as there is no such thing as the average man. Every man and every case of man is special. But if I take the case of a Londoner who works in an office, whose office hours are from 10 to 6, and who spends 50 minutes, morning and evening, in commuting between the door of his house and the door of his office, I shall have come as near as I can to the average. There are men who have to work more to live, but there are others who do not have to work so hard. Fortunately, the financial aspect of existence is of no interest to us here. For our present purpose, the clerk who earns £1 a week is exactly as well off as the millionaire on the terrace of Carlton House. Now, the great and profound mistake, which a typical man makes, with regard to his day, is a mistake of general attitude, a mistake which vitiates and weakens, as much as 2/3 of his energies and interests. In most cases, he is not exactly passionate about his business, and at best, he does not dislike it. He starts his business functions reluctantly, as late as he can, and finishes them cheerfully, as soon as he can. And his engines, as he goes about his business, are seldom at their maximum HP. I know that angry readers will accuse me of maligning the city worker, but I know the city pretty well, and I stand by what I say. However, in spite of all this, he persists in considering those hours, which go from 10 to 6 o'clock as the day, of which the 10 hours that precede it, and the 6 that follow it, are but a prologue and an epilogue. Such an attitude, unconscious as it is, of course kills his interest in the 16 odd hours, with the result that, though he does not waste them, he does not count them either. He considers them merely as a margin. This general attitude is totally illogical and unhealthy, for it formally gives prominence to a chunk of time and a lot of activities, which a man's only idea is to spend, and to have finished. If a man subordinates 2/3 of his existence to a single third, for which he certainly does not feel an absolutely feverish enthusiasm, how can he expect to live fully and completely? He cannot. If my typical man wishes to live fully and completely, he must, in his mind, organize a day within a day. And this day within a day, a Chinese box in a larger Chinese box, must begin in the evening, and end in the morning. It is a day of 16 hours, and during all these 16 hours, he has nothing to do but cultivate his body and soul, and his fellow men. During those 16 hours he is free, he is not a hireling, he is not concerned with monetary worries, he is as good as a man with a private income. This must be his attitude. And his attitude is the most important thing. His success in life, much more important than the amount of property on which his executors will have to pay inheritance tax, depends on it. What? Are you saying that all the energy devoted to those 16 hours will diminish the value of the 8 hours of the business? No, it won't. On the contrary, it will certainly increase the value of the 8 hours of work. One of the main things my typical man has to learn is that the mental faculties are capable of hard and continuous activity, they do not tire like an arm or a leg. All they want is change, and not rest, with the exception of sleep. I will now examine the actual method of the typical man, to employ the 16 hours which are entirely his own, beginning with his rising. I shall confine myself to indicating the things he does, and those which I think he ought not to do, postponing my suggestions for planting the hours which I shall have cleared, as a settler clears spaces in a forest. To his credit I must say, he wastes very little time before he leaves home in the morning. In too many houses he gets up at 9 o'clock, has breakfast between 9 and 9:30, and then rushes out. But as soon as he knocks at the front door, his mental faculties, which are tireless, become idle. He heads for the station in a state of mental coma. When he gets there, he usually has to wait for the train. In hundreds of commuter stations, you see every morning, men quietly walking up and down the platforms, while the railroad companies unashamedly rob them of their time, which is more than money. Hundreds of thousands of hours are thus lost every day, simply because the typical man thinks so little of time that it has never occurred to him to take easy enough precautions against the risk of its loss. He has a solid currency of time to spend every day, call it a sovereign. He must get change for it, and to get it he is content to lose a great deal. Supposing that in selling him a bill, the company were to say to him, "We will change a sovereign for you, but we will charge you 3 halfpence for doing so," what would my man exclaim? What would my typical man exclaim? Yet that is what the company does when it robs you of 5 minutes twice a day. You say I talk about minutiae. I do. And I'll justify myself later. Now, will you kindly buy your paper and get on the train? Chapter 5. Tennis and the Immortal Weapon. You board the morning train with your paper, and you give yourself to it, quietly and majestically. You are in no hurry. You know you have at least half an hour of safety ahead of you. As your gaze idly lingers on the advertisements for ships and songs, which appear on the outer pages. His air is the air of an idle man, rich in time, of a man from some planet, where there are 124 hours in a day, instead of 24. I am a passionate reader of newspapers. I regularly read 5 English dailies and 2 French dailies, and only press agents know how many weeklies. I am obliged to mention this personal fact, lest I should be accused of prejudice against newspapers, when I say that I object to reading newspapers on the morning train. Newspapers are produced quickly, to be read quickly. In my daily schedule, there is no place for newspapers. I read them as I can, at ungodly hours. But I do read them. The idea of devoting 30 or 40 consecutive minutes of wonderful solitude to them, for nowhere can one immerse oneself more perfectly in oneself than in a compartment full of silent, withdrawn, smoking men, repulses me. I cannot allow you to waste invaluable pearls of time with such an oriental waste. You are not the Shah of time. Let me respectfully remind you that you have no more time than I do. No more reading the newspaper on the trains. I have already wasted about 3/4 of an hour to use them. Now go to your office. And I'll leave you there until 6 o'clock. I am aware that you have nominally an hour, often an hour and a half, at noon, less than half of which you devote to lunch. But I leave it to you to spend as you wish. You can read your newspapers then. I meet you again as I leave your office. You are pale and tired. At any rate, your wife says you are pale, and you give her to understand that you are tired. During the trip home, you have been accumulating this feeling of tiredness. The feeling of weariness hovers over the mighty suburbs of London, like a virtuous and melancholy cloud, especially in winter. You don't eat immediately when you get home. But after an hour or so, you feel you could sit down, and have some nourishment. And you do. Then you smoke, seriously, you see friends, you play cards, you flirt with a book, you notice old age creeping up on you, you take a walk, you stroke the piano. By God, it's already 11:15. Then you spend about 40 minutes thinking about going to bed, and you might find yourself with a really good whiskey. Finally you go to bed, exhausted from the day's work. 6 hours have passed, probably more, since you left the office. They have passed like a dream, they have passed like magic, they have passed inexplicably. This is a good example. But you say, it's all very well for you to talk. A man is tired. He must see his friends. He can't always be on the home stretch. That's right. But when you meet to go to the theater, and especially with a beautiful woman, what happens? You rush to the outskirts, you spare no effort to make yourself glorious in a good suit, you hurry back to town on another train, you stay on the home stretch for 4 hours, if not 5, you take her home, you go home. You don't spend 3/4 of an hour thinking about going to bed. You go. Friends and weariness are equally forgotten, and the night has seemed so exquisitely long, or perhaps too short. And do you remember that time, when you were persuaded to sing in the chorus of the Amateur Operatic Society, and work like a slave, for 2 hours every other night, for 3 months? Can you deny that when you have something definite to look forward to in the evening, something that will employ all your energy, the thought of that something gives a brighter glow and vitality to the whole day? What I suggest to you is that at 6 o'clock in the evening you look the facts in the face, and admit that you are not tired, because you are not, you know that, and that you arrange your evening, so that it will not be interrupted by a meal. That way you'll have at least 3 hours of free space. I am not suggesting that you spend 3 hours every night of your life, expending your mental energy. But I am suggesting that, to begin with, you devote an hour and a half, every other night, to some important and consecutive cultivation of the mind. You will still have 3 nights left for friends, bridge, tennis, domestic scenes, strange readings, pipes, gardening, casseroles and prize contests. You will still have the tremendous wealth of 45 hours between 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon and 10 o'clock on Monday morning. If you persevere, you will soon want to spend 4 evenings, and maybe 5, in some sustained effort to be genuinely alive. And you will give up that habit of muttering to yourself, "It's time to think about going to bed." The man who begins to go to bed, 40 minutes before he opens his bedroom door, is bored, that is, he is not living. But remember, at the outset, that those 90 minutes at night, 3 times a week, must be the most important of the 10,080. They should be sacred as a dramatic rehearsal or a tennis match. Instead of saying, "I'm sorry I can't see you, buddy, but I have to run to the tennis club," you should say, "But I have to work." This, I admit, is intensely difficult to say. Tennis is much more urgent than the immortal soul. Chapter 6. Remembering Human Nature. I have mentioned, incidentally, the vast span of 44 hours, which elapses between leaving business, at 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon, and returning to business, at 10 o'clock Monday morning. And here I must touch upon the point, whether the week should consist of 6 or 7 days. For many years, in fact, until I approached 40, my own week consisted of 7 days. Older and wiser people constantly informed me that more work, and more real life, could be done in 6 days than in 7 days. And it is true that now, with 1 day in 7 in which I follow no schedule, and make no effort except that which the whim of the moment dictates, I intensely appreciate the moral value of a weekly rest. However, if I had to redo my life, I would go back to doing what I have done. Only those who have lived the 7 days of the week to the fullest, for a long time, can appreciate all the beauty of regular and recurring idleness. Besides, I am getting older, and it is a matter of age. In case of abundant youth, and exceptional energy and desire for effort, I should say without hesitation, keep going, day after day. But in the average case I should say, limit your formal program, superprogram, I mean, to 6 days a week. If you want to extend it, do so, but only to the extent of your desire. Consider the extra time as a windfall, not as regular income, so that you can return to a 6-day program, without the feeling of being poorer, of being a backslider. Now let's see where we are. So far we have marked to save from the waste of days, half an hour minimum, on 6 mornings a week, and 1.5 hours, on 3 afternoons a week. In total, 7.5 hours a week. I propose to settle, for the time being, for those 7.5 hours. What, you shout? You pretend to teach us how to live, and you only occupy 7.5 hours, out of 168. Are you going to work a miracle, with your 7.5 hours? Well, not to beat around the bush, I am going to do it, if you will be so kind as to permit me. That is, I am going to ask you to try an experience which, though perfectly natural and explicable, has all the air of a miracle. My contention is, that the full use of those 7.5 hours, will quicken the whole life of the week, add zest to it, and increase the interest you feel, even in the most banal occupations. You practice physical exercises for only 10 minutes, morning and evening. And yet you are not surprised when your health and physical strength benefit every hour of the day, and your whole physical outlook changes. Why wonder that an average of more than an hour a day devoted to the mind can fully enliven the whole activity of the mind? Perhaps more time could be devoted to the cultivation of the self. And to the extent that the time was greater, the results would be greater. But I prefer to begin with what seems an insignificant effort. Actually, it is not a trivial effort, as those who have not yet tried it will discover. Clearing even 7.5 hours of jungle is passably difficult. Some sacrifice must be made. Time may have been misused, but it has been used, something has been done with it, however unwise it may have been. Doing something else means a change of habits. And habits are shit that need to be changed. Besides, any change, even for the better, is always accompanied by inconveniences and discomforts. If you imagine that you are going to be able to dedicate 7.5 hours a week to a serious and continuous effort, and continue doing your usual life, you are wrong. I repeat that some sacrifices will be necessary, and an immense dose of willpower. And it is because I know the difficulty, it is because I know the almost disastrous effect of failure in such an undertaking, that I seriously advise a very humble beginning. You must safeguard your self-respect. Self-love is at the root of all purpose, and a failure in a deliberately planned enterprise causes a desperate wound to self-love. So I repeat and reiterate, begin quietly, without ostentation. When you have conscientiously devoted 7.5 hours a week to the cultivation of your vitality, for about 3 months, then you can begin to sing louder, and to tell yourself, what wonderful things you are capable of doing. Before moving on to the method of utilizing the hours indicated, I have one last suggestion to make. It is that, as far as the evenings are concerned, allow much more than an hour and a half, to do the work of an hour and a half. Remember human nature, and the possibility of accidents. And give yourself, say, a day, for your 90-minute task. Chapter 7. Control of the Mind. People say, you can't help your thoughts. But one really can. Control of the thinking machine is perfectly possible. For nothing happens to us outside our own brain, and since nothing harms us or gives us pleasure but within the brain, the supreme importance of being able to control what goes on in that mysterious brain is obvious. This idea is one of the oldest clichés, but it is a cliché whose profound truth and urgency, most people live, and die, without realizing it. People complain about the lack of the power of concentration, not knowing that they can acquire that power, if they so choose. And without the power of concentration, that is, without the power to dictate to the brain its task and ensure its obedience, true life is impossible. Mental control is the first element of a full existence. It seems to me, therefore, that the first business of the day should be to put the mind to the test. You take care of your body, inside and out, and you run a grave danger in plucking the hairs out of your skin. You employ a whole army of individuals, from the milkman to the pig slaughterer, to enable you to bribe your stomach into behaving decently. Why not devote a little attention to the much more delicate machinery of the mind, especially as you will not need any outside help? It is for this part of the art and craft of living that I have set aside the time from the moment you walk out the door until you arrive at your office. Do I really have to cultivate my mind on the street, on the platform, on the train, and on the crowded street again? That's right, but you don't need tools, and not even a book. However, the matter is not easy. When you leave home, concentrate your mind on one subject, no matter what, to begin with. You won't have gone 10 yards, before your mind has escaped under your own eyes, and is amusing itself with another subject. Bring it back by the scruff of the neck. Before you reach the station, you will have done it about 40 times. Don't despair, keep going and you will succeed. You can't fail if you persevere. It is idle to pretend that your mind is incapable of concentration. Don't you remember that morning when you received a disturbing letter that demanded a very careful reply? How you kept your mind constantly on the subject of the reply without a second's interruption until you reached your office? That was a case where circumstances roused you to such a degree of vitality, that you were able to master your mind like a tyrant. You did not want to do anything foolish. You insisted that your work had to be done, and your work was done. By regular practice of concentration, for which there is no secret, except the secret of perseverance, you can tyrannize your mind, which is not the highest part of your being, every hour of the day, and everywhere. Exercise is very convenient. If you were to get on your morning train, with a pair of dumbbells for your muscles, or a 10-volume encyclopedia for your learning, you would, probably, excite observations. But as you walk down the street or sit in the corner of the compartment, behind a pipe, or hang the strap in the subway, who is going to know that you are performing the most important of daily acts? Watasas can't laugh at you. I don't care what you concentrate on, as long as you do it. What counts is the sheer discipline of the thinking machine. But still, you can kill two birds with one stone, and concentrate on something useful. I suggest, it's just a suggestion, a short chapter of Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus. Don't be ashamed of their names, I beg you. As far as I am concerned, I know of nothing more current, and more replicated in common sense applicable to everyday life, from simple people like you and me, who hate airs and graces, posturing and nonsense, than Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus. Read a chapter at night, and concentrate on it the next morning. You will see. Yes, my friend, it is useless for you to try to disguise it. I can hear your brain as if it were a telephone in your ear. You're saying to yourself, this guy was doing pretty well, until he got to the 7th chapter. I had started to get mildly interested. But what he says about thinking about trains, and concentration, and so on, is not for me. It may be all right for some people, but it's not in my line. It is for you, I repeat passionately, it is for you. In fact, it is to you that I am addressing myself. If you dismiss the suggestion, you will dismiss the most valuable suggestion ever offered to you. It is not my suggestion. It is the suggestion of the most sensible, practical, hard-nosed men who ever walked the earth. I give it to you only at second hand. Try it. Hold your mind in your hand. And see how the process cures half the ills of life, especially worry, that miserable, avoidable, shameful disease, worry. Chapter 8. The reflective state of mind. The exercise of concentration of mind, to which at least half an hour a day should be devoted, is a mere preliminary, like scales on the piano. Once power has been acquired, over that most unruly member of one's complex organism, it must naturally be jugulated. It is useless to possess an obedient mind unless one benefits to the greatest possible degree from its obedience. A prolonged course of primary study is indicated. Now, as to what this course of study should be, there can be no doubt, there never has been. All sensible people of all ages are agreed upon it. And it is not literature, nor any other art, nor history, nor any science. It is the study of oneself. Man, know thyself. These words are so trite that, in truth, it makes me blush to write them. However, they must be written, because it is necessary that I do so. I retract my blush, ashamed of it. Man, know thyself, and I say it out loud. The phrase is one of those phrases that everyone knows, that everyone recognizes its value, and that only the most astute put into practice. I don't know why. I am totally convinced that what is most lacking today in the life of the average well-meaning person is a reflective disposition. We do not reflect. I mean, we do not reflect on really important things. About the problem of our happiness, about the main direction in which we are going, about what life gives us, about the role that reason has, or does not have, in determining our actions, and about the relationship between our principles and our conduct. And yet, you are looking for happiness, aren't you, and have you discovered it? Most likely not. Most likely, you have already come to believe that happiness is unattainable. But men have attained it. And they have attained it by understanding that happiness does not arise from the attainment of physical or mental pleasures, but from the development of reason, and from the adequacy of conduct to principles. I suppose you will not have the audacity to deny this. But if he admits it, and yet devotes no part of his day to the deliberate consideration of his reason, his principles, and his conduct, he admits also that, while he is striving to attain a given thing, he regularly leaves undone the act necessary to attain it. And now, who will blush, will it be me or will it be you? Do not fear that I intend to impose certain principles on your attention. I do not care, in this place, what your principles are. Your principles may induce you to believe in the justice of robbery. I don't care. All I insist is that a life, in which the conduct does not agree pretty well with the principles, is a foolish life. And that conduct can only be made to accord with principle by daily examination, reflection and resolution. What leads to the permanent sadness of thieves is that their principles are contrary to theft. If they truly believed in the moral excellence of theft, penal servitude would simply mean for them many happy years. All martyrs are happy because their conduct and their principles always agree with each other. As for reason, which is the one that behaves, and is not alien to the elaboration of principles, it plays a much smaller role in our lives than we really believe. We are supposed to be reasonable, but we are much more instinctive than reasonable. And the less we reflect, the less reasonable we are. The next time you get angry with the waiter because your steak is overdone, ask reason to enter the cabinet of your mind and consult with him. He will probably tell you that the waiter didn't cook the steak, and that he had no control over its cooking, but even if he were the only one to blame, you didn't accomplish any good by getting angry. You simply lost your dignity, made a fool of yourself in the eyes of sensible men, besides enraging the waiter, while producing no effect on the steak. The result of this consultation with reason will be that, when once again your steak is overdone, you will treat the waiter as a fellow man, keep calm in a kindly spirit and politely insist on being served another steak. The gain will be evident and solid. In the formation or modification of principles, and in the practice of conduct, much help may be obtained from printed books, published from 6d each. In my last chapter, I mentioned Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. Some even better known works will immediately come to mind. I may also mention Pascal, La Bruyere, and Emerson. As for me, I do not go on a trip without my dear Marcus Aurelius. Yes, books are valuable. But the reading of books will not substitute for a daily, sincere and honest examination of what one has done recently, and what one is going to do, for a firm look at oneself in the face, however disconcerting the vision may be. When will this important matter take place? The solitude of the evening walk home, I find, seems to me suitable for it. A reflective mood naturally follows the effort of having earned one's livelihood for the day. Of course, if instead of attending to an elementary and profoundly important duty, you prefer to read the newspaper, something you might as well do while waiting for dinner, I have nothing to say. Although you must attend to it at some point during the day. I now pass on to the evening hours. Chapter 9. Interest in the Arts. Many people, pursue a regular and uninterrupted course of idleness in the evenings, because they think that there is no alternative to idleness than the study of literature, and it turns out that they have no taste for literature. This is a great mistake. Of course it is impossible, or at any rate very difficult, to study anything properly, without the aid of printed books. But if one wishes to understand all the depths of bridge or sailing, he should not fail to read the best books on bridge or sailing, because of his lack of interest in literature. We must distinguish, therefore, between literature and books dealing with non-literary subjects. I will talk about literature in due course. Let me now point out, to those who have never read Meredith, and who are capable of remaining unmoved, in the face of a discussion as to whether Mr. Stephen Phillips is or is not a true poet, that they are perfectly within their rights. It is not a crime not to love literature. It is not a sign of imbecility. The mandarins of literature will order the instant execution of the unfortunate individual who does not understand, for example, the influence of Wordsworth on Tennyson. But that is but their chutzpah. Where would they be, I wonder, if they were asked to explain the influences that contributed to Tchaikovsky's pathetic symphony? There are enormous fields of knowledge, outside of literature, that will yield magnificent results for those who cultivate them. For example, since I have just mentioned the piece of high-level music, most popular in England today, I recall that the promenade concerts begin in August. You go to them. You smoke your cigar or cigarette, and I'm sorry to tell you, you light your matches during the soft chords of the overture to Lohengrin and enjoy the music. But you say that you don't know how to play the piano or the violin, or even the banjo, that you don't know anything about music. That you have a real taste in music is shown by the fact that, to fill your hall with you and your companions, the conductor is forced to provide programs, from which bad music is almost totally excluded, a change from the old days of Covent Garden. However, his inability to play The Maiden's Prayer on a piano should not prevent him from familiarizing himself with the construction of the orchestra, which he listens to a couple of nights a week for a couple of months. As it is, you probably think of the orchestra as a heterogeneous mass of instruments that produce a confusing and pleasant sound mass. You don't hear the details, because you have never trained your ears to hear them. If he were asked to name the instruments, which play the great theme at the beginning of the symphony, in C minor, he could not for the life of him name them. Yet you admire the symphony in C minor. It has moved you, and will move you again. You have even talked about it, in an expansive mood, with that lady, you know who I mean. And the only thing you can claim about the symphony in C minor, is that Beethoven composed it, and that it is a very good thing. Now, if you have read, for example, Mr. Krehbiel's book, How to Listen to Music, which can be obtained in any bookstore, for less than the cost of a stall in the Alhambra, and which contains photographs of all the orchestral instruments and plans of the arrangement of the orchestras, I would then attend a strolling concert, with an astonishing intensification of interest in it. Instead of a confused mass, the orchestra would appear to you as what it is, a wonderfully balanced organism, whose various groups of members each have a different and indispensable function. You would see the instruments, and hear their respective sounds. You would know the gulf that separates a French horn from an English horn, and you would perceive why a hautboy player receives higher salaries than a violinist, even though the violin is the most difficult instrument. You would live in a traveling concert, whereas before, you were limited to exist there in a beatific coma, like a baby contemplating a shiny object. You could lay the foundations of an authentic and systematic knowledge of music. You could specialize your research in a particular form of music, such as the symphony, or in the works of a particular composer. At the end of a year, of 48 weeks of 3 short evenings each, combined with the study of programs, and attendance at concerts, chosen from your growing knowledge. Thus you would really know something of music, even if you were as far away as ever, from sounding the Maiden's Prayer on the piano. But I hate music, you say. My dear sir, I respect you. What applies to music, applies to the other arts. I might mention, How to Look at Pictures, by Claremont Witt, or, How to Judge Architecture, by Russell Sturgis, as beginnings, only beginnings, of a vitalizing systematic knowledge in other arts, whose study materials abound in London. I hate all the arts, you will say. My dear sir, I respect you more and more, and I will deal with your case next, before turning to literature. Chapter 10. Nothing in life is monotonous. Art is a great thing, but it is not the greatest thing. The most important of all perceptions, is the continuous perception of cause and effect, that is, the perception of the continuous development of the universe, or in other words, the perception of the course of evolution. When one has got into one's head, the main truth, that nothing happens without a cause, one becomes not only a big-minded person, but also a big-hearted one. It is hard to have one's watch stolen, but one reflects that the thief of the watch became a thief, thanks to causes of heredity and environment, which are as interesting as they are scientifically understandable. And one buys another watch, if not with joy, at least with a philosophy that makes bitterness impossible. One loses, in the study of cause and effect, that absurd air that so many people have, of always being shocked and pained, by the curious of life. Such people live in the midst of human nature, as if it were a foreign country, full of horrible foreign customs. But, having reached maturity, one should be ashamed to be a stranger in a strange land. The study of cause and effect, while lessening the pain of life, adds to its picturesqueness. The man to whom evolution is but a name, sees the sea as a grandiose and monotonous spectacle, which he can witness in August for 3 shillings, round-trip third class. The man imbued with the idea of development, of continuous cause and effect, perceives in the sea an element which in geology the day before yesterday was steam, which yesterday was boiling, and tomorrow will inevitably be ice. He perceives that a liquid is nothing but something that is on its way to becoming solid, and a sense of the tremendous and changing picturesqueness of life penetrates him. Nothing will give more lasting satisfaction than the constantly cultivated appreciation of this. It is the end of all science. Cause and effect are everywhere to be found. Rents went up in Shepherd's Bush. It was painful, and shocking, that rents went up at Shepherd's Bush. But to some extent, we are all scientific students of cause and effect, and there was no employee lunching at a Lyons restaurant, who did not scientifically add 2 plus 2. And saw in the former twopenny tube, the cause of excessive demand for wigwams, in Shepherd's Bush, and in excessive demand for wigwams, the cause of the rising price of wigwams. Simple, you will say dismissively. Everything, the whole complex movement of the universe, is as simple as that, when you can put 2 and 2 together. So, my dear sir, perhaps you are a clerk in a real estate agency, and you hate the arts, and you want to promote your immortal soul, but you cannot be interested in your business, because it is so monotonous. Nothing is dull. The tremendous and ever-changing picturesqueness of life is wonderfully displayed in a real estate agent's office. What do I mean? There was a traffic blockade in Oxford Street, and to avoid the blockade, people started to travel under basements and sewers, and the result of this was an increase in rents in Shepherd's Bush. And you say that's not picturesque. Suppose you were to study, in this spirit, the real estate question in London, for an hour and a half every other afternoon. Would it not give a new impulse to your business, and transform your whole life? You would come to more difficult problems, and you could tell us why, as a natural result of cause and effect, the longest straight street in London is 5 feet long. whereas the absolute longest straight street in Paris stretches for miles. I think you will admit that I have not chosen an example particularly conducive to my theories, such as an estate agency clerk. Are you a bank clerk, and have you not read that breathless romance, disguised as a scientific study, called Lombard Street, by Walter Bagehot? Ah, my dear sir, if you had begun with that, and followed it, for 90 minutes every other night, how captivating your business would be to you, and how much more clearly you would understand human nature. You are shut up in the city, but you love excursions in the country, and the observation of wildlife, surely, a heart-enriching diversion. Why not walk out of your front door, in slippers, to the nearest gas lamp of an evening, with a butterfly net, and observe the wildlife of common and rare moths, beating there? Then coordinate the knowledge thus obtained, and build a superstructure on it, to in the end come to know something about something. It is not necessary to devote oneself to the arts, nor to literature, in order to live fully. The whole field of habit and of the daily scene is waiting to satisfy that curiosity, which means life, and whose satisfaction means an understanding heart. I promise to treat your case, O man who hates art and literature, and I have treated it. I pass now to the case of the happily very common person, who likes to read. Chapter 11. Serious reading. Novels are excluded from serious reading, so that the man who, bent on bettering himself, has decided to devote 90 minutes 3 times a week, to the careful study of the works of Charles Dickens, will do well to modify his plans. The reason is not that the novels are not serious. Some of the world's great literary works are presented in prose form. It is that bad novels should not be read, and that good novels never demand any appreciable mental application on the part of the reader. Only the bad parts of Meredith's novels are a bit difficult. A good novel keeps you going, like a boat down a stream, and you arrive at the end, perhaps breathless, but not exhausted. The best novels involve the least effort. Now, in the cultivation of the mind, one of the most important factors is precisely the feeling of effort, of difficulty, of a task that one part of you is anxious to accomplish, and another part of you is anxious to evade. And that feeling cannot be achieved when tackling a novel. You don't get your teeth set on reading Anna Karenina. Therefore, although you should read novels, you should not read them in those 90 minutes. Imaginative poetry produces a much greater mental tension than novels. It produces probably the most severe tension of any form of literature. It is the highest form of literature. It produces the highest form of pleasure, and it teaches the highest form of wisdom. In a word, there is nothing to compare with it. I say this, with the sad awareness, that most people do not read poetry. I am convinced that many excellent people, if faced with the alternatives of reading Paradise Lost, and walking around Trafalgar Square, at noon, on their knees and dressed in sackcloth, would choose the ordeal of public ridicule. Still, I shall never cease to advise my friends and enemies, to read poetry before anything else. If poetry is to you what is called a sealed book, begin by reading Hazlitt's famous essay, on the nature of poetry in general. It is the best of its kind in English, and no one who has read it, can get the wrong idea, that poetry is a medieval torture, or a mad elephant, or a gun that shoots itself and kills at 40 paces. In fact, it is hard to imagine the mood of the man who, after reading Hazlitt's essay, does not urgently wish to read some poetry, before his next meal. If the essay inspires him so much, I suggest that he begin with purely narrative poetry. There is an infinitely better English novel, written by a woman, than anything by George Eliot, or the Brontes, or even Jane Austen, whom you may not have read. It is entitled Aurora Leigh, and its author is E.B. Browning. It is written in verse, and contains a considerable amount of poetry, really very good poetry. Decide to read that book to the end, even if you are dying for it. Forget that it's good poetry. Read it simply for the story, and the social ideas. And when you've done that, ask yourself honestly, if you still dislike poetry. I have known more than one person to whom, Aurora Lee, has served to prove, that in supposing that she hated poetry, she was indeed very much mistaken. Of course, if after Hazlitt, and an experiment of this kind, made in the light of Hazlitt, you finally ascertain that there is something in you, which is antagonistic to poetry, then you must be content with history or philosophy. I shall regret it, but not inconsolably. Decline and Fall should not be named on the same day as Paradise Lost, but it is an enormously beautiful thing. And Herbert Spencer's First Principles simply laughs at the pretensions of poetry, and refuses to be accepted as anything but the most majestic product of any human mind. I do not suggest that any of these works are suitable for a beginner in mental tensions. But I see no reason why any man of average intelligence should not, after a year's continued reading, be fit to assail the supreme masterpieces of history or philosophy. The great convenience of the masterpieces is that they are astonishingly lucid. I do not suggest any particular work as a beginning. The attempt would be futile, in the space of my command. But I have two general suggestions, of some importance. The first is to define the direction and scope of your efforts. Choose a limited period, or a limited subject, or a single author. Say to yourself, I am going to know something about the French Revolution, or about the rise of the railroad, or about the works of John Keats. And for a certain period, which should be established beforehand, limit yourself to your choice. The pleasure of being a specialist is very great. The second suggestion is to think as well as read. I know people who read, and for all the good it does them, they might as well cut the bread and butter. They are fond of reading as well as the best men are fond of drinking. They travel the lands of literature in an automobile, for the sole purpose of getting around. They will tell you how many books they have read in a year. Unless you devote about 45 minutes to careful and wearisome, at first it is a bore, reflection on what you are reading, your 90 minutes of an afternoon will be mostly wasted. This means your pace will be slow, but don't worry. Forget about the goal, and think only of the country around you. After a while, perhaps when you least expect it, you will suddenly find yourself in a charming city on a hill. Chapter 12. Dangers to Avoid. I cannot end this often too didactic and abrupt advice on making full use of time for the great purpose of living, as opposed to vegetating, without briefly referring to certain dangers that beset the sincere aspirant to life. The first is the terrible danger of becoming the most odious and unbearable person, a prig. Now, a prig is a stubborn fellow, who gives himself airs of superior wisdom. A prig is a pompous fool, who has gone out for a ceremonial stroll and, without realizing it, has lost an important part of his attire, namely his sense of humor. A prig is a tedious individual who, having made a discovery, is so impressed by his discovery that he is capable of becoming seriously upset that the whole world is not also impressed by him. To become unconsciously a prig is both easy and fatal. Therefore, when one launches into the enterprise of using all his time, it is good to remember that one's own time, and not that of others, is the material with which one has to deal. That the earth was rolling along quite comfortably, before one began to balance the hours, and that it will continue to roll along quite comfortably, whether one succeeds or fails, in one's new role as Chancellor of the Treasury of Time. It is better not to talk too much about what one is doing, and not to show too much sadness, at the spectacle of a whole world, deliberately wasting so many hours of each day, and therefore, never really living. In the end, one will realize that, in taking care of oneself, one has done all one could do. Another danger is to be tied to a program, like a slave to a cart. One should not let oneself be carried away by the program. Respect it, but do not worship it like a fetish. A daily employment program is not a religion. This seems obvious. Yet I know men whose lives are a burden to themselves, and a distressing burden to their family and friends, simply because they have failed to appreciate the obvious. "Oh, no," I've heard the martyred wife exclaim, "Arthur always takes the dog out for exercise at 8 o'clock, and he always starts reading at 9:15. So it is impossible that, etc., etc., etc." And the note of absolute finality in that plaintive voice reveals the unsuspected and ridiculous tragedy of a career. On the other hand, a program is a program. And if it is not treated with deference, it ceases to be anything more than a poor joke. Treating the program with just the right amount of deference, without too much or too little elasticity, is as simple as it may seem to the inexperienced. And another danger is to develop a policy of rushing, of becoming obsessed, little by little, with what to do next. In this way, one can come to exist as if in a prison, and one's life can cease to be one's own. One can walk the dog at 8 o'clock, and meditate all the time, on the fact that he must start reading at 9:15, and that he must not be late. And the occasional and deliberate breaking of the schedule will not help to fix things. The evil arises, not from inelastically persisting in what one has tried, but from originally trying too hard, from filling the schedule to the point of exhaustion. The only remedy is to reconstitute the program and try less. But the appetite for knowledge grows by what it is fed, and there are men who come to savor a constant breathless effort. Of them it can be said that a constant breathless rush is better than an eternal sleep. In any case, if the program shows a tendency to be tiresome and yet one does not wish to change it, an excellent palliative is to pass with exaggerated deliberation from one part of it to another. For example, to spend 5 minutes in perfect mental stillness between the chaining of the Street Bernard and the opening of the book. In other words, wasting 5 minutes with full awareness of losing them. The last and main danger I want to point out is one I have already referred to, the risk of failing at the beginning of the enterprise. I must insist on this. A failure at the beginning can easily kill the newborn impulse towards full vitality, and therefore every precaution must be observed to avoid it. The impulse should not be overloaded. Let the rhythm of the first round be even absurdly slow, but let it be as regular as possible. And once decided to perform a certain task, achieve it at all costs, of tedium and disgust. The gain in self-confidence, having accomplished a tedious task, is simply immense. Finally, when it comes to choosing the first occupations of those evening hours, do not be guided only by your taste and your natural inclination. It's all very well to be a walking encyclopedia of philosophy, but if you don't like philosophy, and you like the natural history of alleys, you'd better give up philosophy, and devote yourself to alleys. If you liked this audiobook, and you want to listen to other similar ones, check the video description. Thanks for your visit.